Imagine stepping into a world where power and pleasure were inseparable, where a single evening could alter the course of your career, your reputation, even your survival, and where the walls of marble villas absorbed whispers that decided the fate of provinces. This wasn't some Netflix fantasy or modern tabloid scandal. It was the reality of ancient Rome's infamous gatherings, nights that straddled the line between political theater and unapologetic indulgence. You see, when we think of Rome, we picture gladiators, emperors, legions. But behind the armored facade lay something more intimate and more dangerous: the villa parties. Invite-only spectacles where senators, poets, generals, and courtesans collided under torchlight, their every word and gesture weighed as heavily as any Senate decree. And here's the twist: these weren't just orgies of wine and desire. They were survival games dressed in silk, where a misplaced laugh could brand you a fool, where your ability to quote poetry at the right moment might secure you an alliance, and where gossip, more than any legion, became a weapon. Now ask yourself this: how did a culture that built aqueducts, roads, and law codes also build an underground economy of seduction and excess? The truth is that Roman villa parties were less about lust and more about leverage, less about decadence and more about dominance. They were controlled chaos designed to test who you were when the masks slipped. And in a society obsessed with status, this mattered more than marble monuments. So tonight, we're going to step into that villa together. We'll follow the torchlight through those heavy bronze doors, breathe in the scent of roses and wine, hear the soft notes of a lyre, and discover what it really meant to be summoned, not invited, to Rome's most exclusive stage. And before you dismiss these gatherings as just ancient gossip, think about this: how different are they from the power dinners of CEOs today, or the glittering galas where billionaires make backroom deals under the cover of champagne and candlelight? History has a way of disguising itself, but Rome was never subtle, and by peeling back the curtains of these evenings, we uncover not only their secrets, but our own: the hunger for influence, the craving for recognition, the art of using pleasure as politics. So tighten your toga, or, if you prefer, your imagination, because this is not just history, it's an invitation to a world where survival wore silk, and the games of power were played with grapes, glances, and goblets. To begin with, these parties were never casual. You didn't just wander in with a bottle of cheap wine and hope for olives. You were chosen, and that choice was everything. An invitation to a Roman villa wasn't a gesture of kindness, it was a political calculation wrapped in wax seals and elegant Latin. Imagine receiving a scroll, the seal bearing the crest of a powerful senator or wealthy patron. When you broke it open, it didn't simply say, "Come, enjoy food and drink." It said you have been selected, evaluated, and deemed useful. It was less of a friendly gesture and more of a summons, like the gods themselves had called you down from Olympus. But here's the catch: this wasn't flattery, it was leverage. To be invited meant someone believed you were valuable, or at least pliable. And sometimes being pliable was more important. For many, it was a double-edged gift. Decline the invitation, and risk being labeled arrogant or disloyal. Accept and risk being judged for how you carried yourself under the weight of candlelight. Even the seating was strategy. If you were placed near the host, congratulations, your every move was being scrutinized, you were under the spotlight. If you were tucked by the wine table, you might be entertainment, a liability, or worse, forgettable. And in Rome, being forgettable was as fatal as being scandalous. These guest lists were never random. The senator who passed new laws last week might be seated beside a poet whose verses flirted with obscenity. Across from them could be a general holding not just a goblet of wine but the future of a province. The guest mix was chemistry, volatile and deliberate. One wrong pairing could ignite a feud, one strategic pairing could build an alliance strong enough to topple a rival. And all of this was done under the pretense of pleasure. Yet behind every laugh lingered calculation. This wasn't about who you liked. It was about who you needed, and who could destroy you with a whisper. If this sounds familiar, think about today's exclusive fundraisers where CEOs mingle with senators, or Hollywood after-parties where a single photo with the right face can boost or bury a career. Rome simply did it with more olives and fewer NDAs. But don't be fooled by the silks and perfumes. Being chosen didn't mean you belonged. It meant you were being tested, and every detail from the angle of your bow to the speed of your drinking would be noted, judged, remembered. This was the first performance of the night, and many failed before the wine was even poured. The moment you stepped through the villa doors, you were stepping into an orchestrated illusion. Everything from the flicker of the torches to the fragrance in the air was curated to make you feel like Rome itself was embracing you. The courtyard, fountains burbled softly as though they were trying not to overhear the secrets being spoken. Mosaics beneath your sandals glistened in the firelight, depicting myths that were part inspiration, part warning. Couches were angled just so low to the ground and inviting, yet oddly suspicious, as though designed to make you recline into vulnerability. The air carried the mingling scents of roses, wine, and ambition. But here's the truth. The real architects of this world were not the senators or the poets. They were the slaves, silent figures who glided like shadows, adjusting cushions every few moments, pouring wine with surgical precision, fanning guests until their wrists ached, and carrying trays of food sculpted into shapes that made you blush if you looked too long. They were the invisible stage crew of Rome's grand theatre, their existence both omnipresent and ignored. And yet they knew more than anyone else who arrived with whom, who slipped behind curtains, who poisoned a goblet or whispered an offer too low for senators to hear. In their silence lay the city's most dangerous archive. They were living scrolls of gossip and leverage, but socially they were invisible, treated not as people but as extensions of the furniture. If something went wrong, they were the first blamed. If everything went right, they disappeared into anonymity. The irony is that while senators boasted of their wisdom and generals of their conquests, the slaves were the only ones who saw everything clearly. They were Rome's unacknowledged historians, and though they could never speak it aloud, they carried knowledge that could topple reputations faster than any Senate decree. Think of them as the staff at today's high-end galas. Waiters and assistants moving silently around billionaires, catching fragments of scandalous conversations, watching as reputations are made or undone, but never being acknowledged as participants. Power thrives on those who remain unseen, and Rome perfected this arrangement. The party glittered because dozens of unseen hands made it so. And yet, if one slave dropped a goblet, the illusion shattered, revealing that beneath the silks and laughter, this was not effortless luxury. It was fragile theatre resting on exploited labor. Rome knew it. The guests pretended not to, and the slaves, with their blank stares and impeccable posture, bore silent witness to both indulgence and hypocrisy. By the time the couches were filled and the wine was flowing, the true spectacle began, not with dancers or poetry, but with food. Because in Rome, meals were not meals, they were messages. Each platter that appeared carried as much symbolism as sustenance, and it was never subtle. Figs shaped like body parts, Oysters coiled in spirals, so suggestive you wondered if you should look away. Bread baked into forms that seemed designed less for eating and more for blushing. Even honey cakes that winked at you with indecent confidence. A senator might raise a sausage as if it were a sacred relic and bite into it with ceremonial pride. Not because he was hungry, but because every bite was theatre. Every dish whispered the same line, "We have wealth, imagination, and no boundaries." You quickly realized this was less about satisfying an appetite and more about orchestrating reactions. Some dishes were jokes, others were metaphors, all of them deliberate. The Romans didn't eat to survive here. They ate to flaunt, to seduce, to unsettle, and above all to impress. Take the centerpiece, a roasted boar decorated with fruits in places fruits had no business being. When a servant cut into it, it revealed layer upon layer of something gelatinous and unnerving. The message wasn't taste, it was extravagance. We can afford to waste, to shock, to delight, sometimes all at once. And then there was wine, the heartbeat of the night, stronger than modern varieties, always diluted, yet still overwhelming. It wasn't just poured, it was performed. Every cup came with a toast, a quip, a glance across the couch to gauge reaction. Drink too fast, and you looked uncultured. Drink too slow, and you looked calculating. Pace it perfectly, and you became the star of the evening. This wasn't a beverage, it was a prop, a tool, and sometimes a trap. One too many cups, and suddenly you were laughing too loudly at a risk story, or agreeing to a political promise you didn't understand, but declined to drink, and you risked being labeled suspicious or dull. Rome had mastered the art of using food and wine as weapons, hidden daggers wrapped in grapes and goblets. The dinner table became a battlefield, not of swords, but of impressions. Every bite a statement, every sip a gamble, and if you think about it, not much has changed. Today's corporate banquets and diplomatic dinners still operate under the same rules. Every toast carefully timed, every dish plated to make a statement, except Romans were more honest about it. They didn't bother to hide the erotic metaphors or the theatrical absurdity, because for them indulgence was the point, excess was proof of power. And if the gods themselves could feast endlessly on nectar and ambrosia, why shouldn't Rome do the same? The villa wasn't feeding bodies, it was feeding egos, feeding reputations, feeding Rome's insatiable hunger to turn everything, even dinner, into theatre. Once the guests were fed and sufficiently loosened by wine, the villa shifted gears, the lights dimmed, the music changed tempo. And suddenly you were no longer at a dinner, but at a private theatre where the line between art and indulgence blurred into something uniquely Roman. The first act might be a dancer, gliding forward with skin glistening in oil, her silks so sheer they clung to her like water, her movements at once graceful and deliberately provocative, miming myths in ways that left little to imagination. Perhaps she became an eagle, perhaps she embodied Venus rising from the sea, or perhaps she was simply a body moving in rhythm to a lyre. But either way you clapped, because to look away would be even more scandalous. Then came the musicians, men with lutes, who sang odes that rhymed love with dove. Only here, under torchlight, even clichés felt indecent. The crowd laughed, perhaps too loudly, because in Rome, laughter itself was a social signal. Next was the juggler, who might begin with fruit, shift to knives, and end with objects that would have been banned in Athens. His tricks were not about skill, but shock, an embodied metaphor of Rome itself, always testing boundaries, always daring the audience to react. And then came the climax of the entertainment. The theatrical reenactments of myths, But make no mistake, these were not reverent dwellings. They were loose, wild, and dripping with innuendo. Tonight it might be the rapture of Ganymede. Tomorrow perhaps Leda and the Swan, and, no matter the myth, the performance inevitably included moaning, strategically placed laurel wreaths, and props that seemed designed to scandalize. What made these plays important wasn't their artistry but their function. They were permission slips, cues to the audience that the time for polite restraint had ended. Once the play concluded, the air changed. The formalities dissolved, and the guests looked at one another differently. The entertainment was never filler, it was ignition, the spark that allowed the evening to slip from networking to indulgence. And here's the deeper truth: Romans knew what they were doing. Myth and performance gave their excess divine camouflage. If Bacchus and Venus could play without boundaries, then surely mortals could too. By staging their desires as theatre, they transformed indulgence into ritual, scandal into homage, and for a culture obsessed with appearances, this was genius. To the outsider it might look like chaos, but to the Romans it was continuity. Indulgence justified by tradition, excess sanctified by myth, and every clap of approval was both a celebration and an excuse to let go further. By now the villa had transformed, the wine had worked its magic, the performances had stripped away the veneer of civility, and suddenly every glance, every gesture, every brush of a hand became loaded with meaning. Roman flirtation was never clumsy or obvious. It was subtle, coded, a sport in itself. The way someone peeled a fig, the way another reclined just slightly to show confidence, or the way a laugh lingered one beat too long. These were the moves of a society that turned innuendo into currency. No one announced desire directly. It was whispered through metaphors, cloaked in poetry, or suggested by the tilt of a goblet. A senator might compliment a man's biceps with the same tone used to praise civic infrastructure: strong, reliable, enduring, and everyone knew what was meant without it being said. And then there were the curtains, swaths of fabric strategically hung across archways, fluttering mysteriously in the breeze. They weren't dividers, they were invitations, hints that the evening's games could take on new forms in the privacy, or at least the pretense of privacy they offered. Pairs, trios, sometimes groups vanished behind them with practiced ease, returning later with flushed cheeks, tousled hair, or sometimes not returning at all. What mattered wasn't the act itself, but the ritual of pretending not to notice. The entire villa colluded in this dance of discretion. You looked away just long enough to signal respect, but never so long that you missed the gossip. And for those who stayed in the main hall, the flirtation remained a slow-burn spectacle, a theatre of eyes and half-smiles, because the truth was that not every guest wanted indulgence. Some preferred to watch, to hover at the edge of the flame without stepping into it, but all were participants in one way or another. And the brilliance of Rome was that it created a system where indulgence and restraint could coexist, where privacy was simulated by a piece of fabric, and scandal was both inevitable and acceptable so long as it was done with style. What these curtains represented was more than lust. They were thresholds of power, because behind them secrets were exchanged, promises made, and alliances cemented. Seduction was never only about the body. It was about leverage, a whispered pledge to support a cousin's candidacy, a suggestion of transferring legions to a family estate. Even the most intimate encounters were layered with politics, and that is what made them dangerous. In Rome, passion and strategy were never separate. They were intertwined like vines around a column. Every touch was both a caress and a calculation. And while modern parties may not drape curtains across marble halls, the principle remains the same. Deals are still struck in back rooms, reputations still hinge on whispers, and desire still finds ways to disguise itself as diplomacy. What most outsiders never understood is that the real business of Rome was not conducted in the Senate alone, but in these dimly lit villas, behind curtains perfumed with incense, in whispers that carried more weight than any formal decree, while outsiders might assume these gatherings were nothing more than excess. Those who mattered knew they were the true engines of politics. Because once the performances had ended and the togas had loosened, another theatre began, a quieter, sharper one. Senators reclined with courtesans, generals whispered to priestesses, poets leaned against magistrates, and every laugh, every soft-spoken promise was a negotiation cloaked in intimacy. A man might murmur of his support for a cousin's candidacy with the same tone used to offer a fig, a woman draped in nothing but jewelry and confidence might delicately suggest that a legion be transferred closer to her family estate, and remarkably, such requests were often granted, because when you stripped away the marble and the rhetoric, Rome's power was not built on law alone but on proximity, on persuasion, and on the ability to entangle ambition with desire. The villa was linked in silk, an arena where alliances were sealed not with contracts but with glances and favors. Reputations were currency, and reputations could be ruined as quickly as they were made. One misplaced laugh, one poorly timed compliment, one careless remark about Caesar's sandals being overrated, and suddenly you were marked, a footnote in someone else's gossip, remembered not for your wit but for your blunder, and gossip travelled faster than legions. By dawn half the city might already know that you stumbled in your toast, or that you reclined awkwardly like a collapsed senator. And yet, for those who navigated it well, the rewards were immense. Contracts secured, villas renovated, careers catapulted forward. The irony was that while the Senate debated laws in marble halls, the outcomes were often decided here, between silken curtains and goblets of wine. And though modern politics pretends to operate differently, power still thrives in the shadows, whether in backroom deals, luxury retreats, or late-night fundraisers. Rome's lesson remains: clear formal institutions write the laws, but intimacy and influence decide them, and in these villas, pleasure and politics were indistinguishable. One hand fed you grapes, the other rewrote your future, and every guest knew that survival meant mastering not just the language of law, but the language of seduction, discretion, and wit. When the torches finally sputtered and the music fell silent, you might think the party was over, but in Rome the real game began with the sunrise. Guests stirred from couches and marble floors, adjusting their dignity along with their tunics, sipping watered wine that tasted like regret and stale ambition. Servants swept sandals, feathers, and fig stems into baskets, as though erasing the evidence of excess. But nothing could erase memory, because what happened in the villa did not stay in the villa. It spilled into the streets, the forum, the bathhouses, carried by whispers, sharper than swords. Reputations were reshaped over honey cakes and olives, served as damage control breakfast. A man who laughed too loudly might be called uncultured. A woman who slipped behind the wrong curtain might find herself the subject of pointed verses at the next poetry reading. And a senator who miscalculated a toast might discover his rivals now had the perfect anecdote to undermine him in debate. Rome thrived on gossip, and these gatherings were fertile ground. By midday, half the city knew which general left with the woman called the Panther, and the other half was inventing embellishments. Scandal grew in the retelling, sometimes harmless, sometimes lethal. For every clever guest who parlayed a witty toast into an invitation to a magistrate's villa. There was another who found himself suddenly excluded, marked by a single mistake, and yet this fallout was part of the design. The villa was both theatre and trap. It offered opportunity but demanded mastery. Only those who balanced wit, charm, and discretion left with their reputations intact or enhanced. Others carried home not just hangovers but scars that lingered in rumour, and that was Rome's genius. Indulgence and destruction were two sides of the same coin. The party was never only about pleasure. It was about sorting, testing, elevating some, and discarding others. And though centuries have passed, the rhythm is familiar. Today, reputations can rise or collapse after a single photograph, a leaked message, a dinner gone wrong. Ancient Rome had no social media, but it had something equally fast and unforgiving: tongues, sharpened by wine and malice, and once your name was spoken in the wrong tone, it could take years to recover, if ever. So, as you staggered into the Roman sunlight, sandals mismatched, hair dishevelled, one thought echoed above the others. The feast was not the end, it was the beginning. And the truest hangover was not from wine, but from the knowledge that half the city was already talking about you. For all their excess, the Romans were never blind to appearances. They knew these gatherings could be condemned as immoral, and yet they survived for centuries because Rome possessed a remarkable, trick-turning indulgence into piety. If Bacchus drank himself into oblivion, then wine was divine. If Venus tangled lovers in chaos, then seduction was holy. And if Jupiter himself was infamous for his affairs, then surely mortals could be forgiven for a few indiscretions. This was the Roman loophole. They wrapped desire in the language of religion, called it ritual, called it homage, and by doing so transformed what might have been scandal into tradition. A senator stumbling out of a villa at dawn could declare he had honored Bacchus. A courtesan could claim her embrace mirrored Venus's gifts, and philosophers could scribble treatises on how indulgence brought mortals closer to the divine morality. In Rome was not about abstinence, it was about style, discretion, and mythological precedent. To live excessively was acceptable so long as you quoted poetry while doing it, and to seduce shamelessly was forgivable if framed as imitation of the gods. Hypocrisy, perhaps, but also genius, because in Rome no one admitted to sin, they referred it as sanctity. Compare this with today's world, where indulgence is justified as networking, stress relief, or self-care. Different vocabulary, same principle. The Romans simply took it further. Their gods were mirrors of human vice and virtue, alike. So to follow their example was not rebellion but alignment with cosmic order. Even priests who preached against pleasure were caught sneaking into these gatherings, excusing themselves as students of philosophy. The divine loophole was so effective that scandal became survivable. Not because people disbelieved it, but because they recognized it as part of Rome's identity. In truth, these parties were not departures from Roman values. They were Roman values distilled, a culture obsessed with order, constantly seduced by chaos, an empire that justified excess by carving it into myth, and for as long as the gods could be invoked, the laughter of the villa could echo without fear of collapse. Even as centuries passed, as emperors rose and fell, as marble faded and villas crumbled into ruins, the memory of these gatherings lingered like smoke in Roman air. They became legend, half-truth, and warning. Moralists condemned them as signs of decline, poets exaggerated them into satire. Emperors threatened to ban them, only to host even more elaborate versions the next week. But the truth is, these villa parties were never just about scandal. They were about survival, politics, and the art of turning chaos into strategy. They were mirrors of Rome itself, an empire obsessed with order yet constantly seduced by its own appetite for disorder. From these candlelit halls emerged alliances that shifted provinces, rumors that destroyed careers, and reputations that endured longer than statues. They were Rome in miniature, decadent, dangerous, and dazzling, and when we look at them today, we might laugh at the figs shaped like body parts or gasp at the curtain rooms. But beneath the spectacle lies a reminder uncomfortably close to our own world, because we too host gatherings where decisions are made far from official halls, where intimacy and ambition intertwine, where reputations are built or destroyed. Over wine, in boardrooms, at galas, even on private jets, Rome simply made no effort to hide it. Their excess was their honesty. And perhaps that is what unsettles us most. The recognition that power has always thrived in the shadows of pleasure. The lesson then is not to sneer at Rome's decadence, but to understand it. To see how gossip can outpace truth, how a single careless word can shape destiny, how indulgence becomes acceptable when wrapped in ritual, and how even the most civilized society balances on a knife edge between order and appetite. The Romans remind us that reputation is fragile. Influence is forged as much in whispers as in laws, and the theatre of excess is never truly gone. It only changes costume, so the next time you hear of a scandal in the news, a deal struck behind closed doors, or a gathering where appearances matter more than honesty, remember Rome, because those villa nights of silk and scandal were not just their story, they are ours, and the curtain, no matter the century, never really closes.